Now, that's not to say that there aren't any parallels of dying and rising heroes and things like that that predate Christianity. So the closest one to parallel to Jesus that predates is Asclepius. And he was known as a healer. He's a mythical character from the Homeric epics, I believe. So we're talking about nearly a millennium before Jesus, maybe 800 years or so before Jesus. And but he's just a healer. Say, well, that's not that impressive. All right, so the closest parallel to Jesus that comes after him is a guy named Apollonius of Tyana. And he lived in the 1st century and died at the end of the 1st century. But the earliest account we have of him is by Philostratus. And he's writing about 125 years after Apollonius's death. And he says that there are different accounts, like there's some accounts that he died, other accounts that he did not die. So they're not even in accord there.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Michael Licona, also known as Mike, which is what he would like for me to call him for this episode. Welcome, Mike. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Lisa.
It's great to have you on. Before we start talking about our topic today, just give our audience just a little bit of background about yourself.
Well, I'm 57 years old. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and became a Christian at the age of 10. I was a little different than most kids. Around the age of 7 or 8, I just started asking my mom, how do I get to heaven? And I was really interested in that. I don't know why. Maybe it was the Lord drawing me. I don't know why. And she'd say, well, if you do more good than bad, you'll get to heaven. And, I pulled my sister's hair. I hit her. I made her cry. And I said, well, what if I do more bad than good? She said, well, then you go to hell to be with the devil forever. And I thought, well, where am I on that scale? And around age 10, I was in church, and this Christian magician, illusionist, whatever you'd like to call them, came in, and they pulled all the youth together, and he did a show, but he would relate some of the things he was doing to the gospel. And for the first time in my life, I understood that it wasn't what I did. It was what Christ did for me that provided forgiveness of sins, and that I could have eternal life through Christ. So I got tricked into heaven, into Christianity. So, but I became a Christian. I didn't grow a whole lot during my teen years spiritually. I went to Liberty University. I was a music major. And there it just really got me very interested in spiritual things. And so I wanted to learn Greek so I could read the New Testament in its original language. And so I went to grad school, and toward the end, my last semester, I was experiencing some real doubts about the Christian faith. And I'd never had that before. It was a matter of, it wasn't a matter of anything I learned. It was kind of, well, if I'd been born in Afghanistan, maybe I'd be a Muslim. Or if I'd been born in China, I'd be an atheist. India, I'd be a Hindu. So why am I a Christian? Is it because Christianity is true, or is it because that's the way I was brought up? And so I started having these doubts, and I went to one of my roommates recommended Gary Habermas, who taught philosophy and apologetics at Liberty. Never had him for a course, and spoke with him, went to his office, spoke with him, and he settled my doubts for the moment. And then I finished up my classwork, and then went home back to Baltimore. And I guess at that point, then I started coming in contact with atheists for the first time in my life, and skeptics, and they were raising questions I didn't know how to answer. And that got me more and more interested. I called Habermas, and he'd give me some answers, and he'd refer me to books to read. And I just read and read. And so that's what got me involved in apologetics. And then I guess there's one other thing I could add to that, this equation about the short bio about myself, is that I continued to doubt off and on, and I learned later that this is just part of the way I'm wired. And it's not just my faith I doubt, it's everything. Did I marry the right woman? Did I buy the right car, the right house, the right watch, the right cologne? Something like that. I question everything. And something as important as the eternal destiny of my soul, I wanted to get right in terms of the worldview. So I ended up doing a PhD and looking at the resurrection of Jesus to see does the evidence really point in that direction. And during that period, I just got obsessed. My doctoral dissertation ended up being 3 to 4 times longer than the average one.
Oh,
I ended up debating atheists, some of the leading atheists, and also skeptics and Muslims in the world, because I figured I want to know the truth, no matter where it leads. And I would pray, God, if Christianity is true, I think there's certainly enough evidence to show that God exists. But if Christianity for some reason is not true, then show me. Even if you have to humiliate me, I'm fine with that. I just want to follow truth. I want to follow you. Because I guess I felt I didn't have anything to fear with truth. What my fear was is that my own biases would keep me from embracing truth, even if I saw it, because I had my own bias for my own particular view. So I tried to be as open-minded as possible. And that's why I debated some of these leading non-believers, because I figured, I might have biases toward my view. They don't have those same biases. They have their own toward their own views, but not toward the Orthodox Christian view. So, but the more I started to debate them on the resurrection, the more I became convinced that actually occurred because of the weakness of their arguments. So that's a little about my journey. Been married 31 years to a wonderful wife. I have 2 kids, and one's married, the other's a firefighter. And so we live in the Atlanta area. So a little about me.
that's
I'm
awesome.
also a professor at Houston Baptist University, and we have our own nonprofit ministry on the side, risenjesus.com.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I see when I was looking at your website that you debated Bart Ehrman, which is an interesting part of my story, because when I took New Testament in undergrad, he was our textbook. So I thought I was taking like I thought it was going to be like Sunday school. But shortly I found out after I enrolled in the course that it was nothing like that, which I'm sure you've heard that story millions of times.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. In fact, I had a grad student once who said he sat in Ehrman's class in that New Testament, or he sat in Ehrman's New Testament intro class where he uses that same textbook that you had. And he said the first day of class, Ehrman said, how many of you are Christians? And there's like 400, 450 people in the room. And he said about a half a dozen people raised their hand. It makes me wonder why they took Ehrman then for a New Testament intro, if they're not believers. But about half a dozen raised their hand. And he said, by the end of the semester, my goal is to have you doubt everything you believe. So it's just like in that movie, God is Not Dead, only Bart Ehrman was the antagonistic professor. And it happens all over this country. It really does.
Yeah, it really does. So we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to your heart, the resurrection. And I titled this episode "Resurrection, Fact or Fiction," because people do think it's fiction. It's hard to believe for many people, but if you're a Christian, it is at the crux of our belief. You can't not believe in the resurrection and be a Christian. What is the most common objection to the resurrection that you see or in your ministry, throughout your debates, throughout your talks with students? What is the most common objection?
Well, the most common objection amongst more sophisticated thinkers, I should say, and that would be people like scholars that I would debate and, people who really look into the stuff, would be that the disciples experienced hallucinations of the risen Jesus. And they were grief-stricken. And, on the surface, that sounds plausible, right? It sounds reasonable. But then when you look into it, you find that the hallucination hypothesis ends up being perhaps the very weakest one out there for a number of reasons. Number one, not everybody is a candidate for a hallucination, even if you're in the same frame of mind. So, for example, numerous studies on hallucinations done over the past century and longer have shown that the group most likely or most prone to experience a hallucination, the kind of people, are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. And only about 7%, 50% of them experience a hallucination of some sort. That's quite a bit, but it's only 50%, not 100%, okay? 50%. But even so, out of all of those senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one, only 7% experience visual hallucinations of their loved one. Now, what's the difference between that and the 50%? Well, not all hallucinations are visual. Some are auditory. Some are, you have a sense of smell. You smell their perfume or something, but or there's the of taste, there's of motion, there's of being touched. There's these multiple modes of hallucinations, and the kind of hallucination that is experienced most by senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one is the sense of presence of that person in the room. You don't see them, smell them, hear them, feel them, anything. You just kind of have the sense that they're in the room. And of the 50% who experience hallucinations, 39% of them have that kind of a hallucination. That's the most common. But of the 50% who experience them, only 14% of them, or 7% of all senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one, experience a visual hallucination. Now, so that's one thing. The disciples, according to all the reports we have, all of them, 100% of them experienced an appearance of Jesus, which is beyond. You either have to say that the reports are lying, of course, or you just say this wasn't a hallucination. Another problem with it is what we learned is our knowledge of from the field of psychology, the mental health profession, is that hallucinations occur in the mind of an individual. They're like dreams. I can't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having this dream that we're in Hawaii. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have this free vacation. Because it's a private occurrence. That's not group. Now, she might go back to sleep and dream she's in Hawaii, but we're not having the same dream. We're not participating with one another in the same dream, having the same conversation, and maybe have an argument in the dream and then wake up and continue that argument. No, because it didn't really happen. It's not reality in the dream, okay? And it's the same thing with hallucinations. Hallucinations are false sensory perceptions. We are perceiving something that's not really there. So you can't have a group hallucination. You, in fact, a book that was published by the American Psychological Association, Hallucinations, the Science of Idiosyncratic Perception. They talk about all the research on hallucinations over the past century, and they don't deal with group hallucinations. I contacted the authors. I said, why didn't you? They said, we could not find a single documented case of a group hallucination. And what we understand about the mind, they can't occur. And then finally, a group hallucination, hallucinations do not account for the appearance to Paul. Paul was out persecuting the church. He wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. He thought Jesus was a false and failed Messiah. And so he believed it was God's will to destroy that movement Jesus had started. So Jesus would have been the very last person in the universe Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. So the hallucination hypothesis, even though it's the most popular objection or alternative hypothesis to the resurrection offered by scholars today, it's probably the weakest.
Mm-hmm. Amongst those who aren't scholars, what is one of the leading objections you hear?
Oh, boy. Well, you'll have some on the internet say, well, Jesus never existed. If he never existed, he couldn't have risen from the dead. And, that is a position that is just, it's considered insanity by scholars. In fact, the leading proponent of that amongst scholars of the view that Jesus never existed is a guy named Richard Carrier, an atheist historian. And he says, even when including himself, he only knows of 8 historians in the world who would say that Jesus never existed. So imagine if there were only 8 scholars who said that Jesus rose from the dead. we would be laughed and mocked, and rightfully so. But that's all that's all the scholars who would say in the relevant fields who would say that Jesus never existed. 8. So, I mean, it's just a ridiculous position. You have to really do a lot of unbridled speculation and ad hoc constructions without a shred of evidence in order to get to that kind of conclusion. And that's why almost all scholars, 99.999% of all scholars, have rejected that hypothesis. That's one of them. Another one you'll hear is miracles just don't occur today. We don't see them today. And for them, I'd just say, well, get out of your own a world of skeptical subculture and go to some third world countries or go to some people here in the US who have experienced miracles. There's plenty of people like this. So that objection just flies in the face of some really good evidence to the contrary. So there's many others, but those things are pretty easily refuted.
One that I've heard recently, well, I've heard this in the past, but I heard it again yesterday, was the idea of it being a copycat narrative. That there are plenty of people who had this idea of dying and rising again, and it's just a copycat story that they've taken from Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology. What is your response to that?
Well, I'd say, first of all, I would probably ask them, like, who do you have in mind, and what evidence is there for it? Because most of the examples that are typically cited are spurious. They get it from pop books written by non-scholars, and when you go to check out, their documentation of it, there is none. Or if there is some, then you go to that what they're referring to, and they don't provide documentation. So, and then you talk to scholars on, say, Buddhism or Hinduism or some of these, and they say that person doesn't know what they're talking about. There is nothing like that. Now, that's not to say that there aren't any parallels of dying and rising heroes and things like that that predate Christianity. So the closest one to parallel to Jesus that predates is Asclepius. And he was known as a healer. He's a mythical character from the Homeric epics, I believe. So we're talking about nearly a millennium before Jesus, maybe 800 years or so before Jesus. And but he's just a healer. Say, well, that's not that impressive. All right, so the closest parallel to Jesus that comes after him is a guy named Apollonius of Tyana. And he lived in the 1st century and died at the end of the 1st century. But the earliest account we have of him is by Philostratus. And he's writing about 125 years after Apollonius's death. And he says that there are different accounts, like there's some accounts that he died, other accounts that he did not die. So they're not even in accord there. And then there is only one account that he provides of post-death appearance of Apollonius. And it's in a setting, we don't know when it happened, whether it was days, weeks, months, or years after his death. But it says a bunch of followers of Apollonius were together and just kind of hanging out, and one had fallen asleep, and he woke up and he said Apollonius appeared to him in a dream and no one else saw him. Well, is that the same thing as the resurrection of Jesus? So that in order to get a single Jesus, you have to combine a lot of different figures, like a Dionysius, who was a son of Zeus, who had a divine paternity and who had his life threatened, and who made wine. And then you take a Thor who had his life threatened at birth, and you take the Asclepius and the Apollonius, and then you add Hercules, who, because he was sick, he built a very large fire, threw himself into it to kill himself, and then it was said that he was seen ascending to heaven on the horse Pegasus. Now, that really doesn't sound a whole like Jesus' story, but what they'll do is they'll take that one item about ascending to heaven, forget his suicide, forget that he ascended on a horse. He ascended to heaven. That's the only thing they pick out of that. So they pick out only those items that are similar to Jesus from all these different figures who had existed, whether historical or legendary, over more than 1,000-year period, and you put them all together to get one Jesus. Now you can see why historians don't find that persuasive. It would be like saying, well, Abraham Lincoln was a tall, lanky Illinois senator who became president and was elected to 2 terms. John F. Kennedy was a U.S. president who graduated from Harvard. David Palmer was a character in the popular television series 24 who portrayed the first Black U.S. president. You put all 3 of these figures together and you get Barack Obama, a tall, lanky Illinois senator who was elected to 2 terms as president. He graduated from Harvard and was the first Black U.S. president. Therefore, Barack Obama didn't exist. Therefore, the story about Barack Obama is just legend that borrowed from parallel from other accounts. And you'd say, that's insane. You have to only pick and choose certain qualities or characteristics of that person from 3 different characters that lived over 2 centuries. Well, wait a minute. With Jesus, you're taking about a half dozen figures that existed over 1,000-year or more period in order to get one Jesus there. That's what's going on. So there's a lot of different responses I could provide to that, but that's just one of them.
Yeah, and I think that's excellent and helpful to those who are wrestling with this idea of copycat and putting parallel, because, you know, social media memes and things like that and conspiracy videos, it's like it can be very persuasive if you post I've seen like they do like a kind of like a split screen video where they show like these mythical characters and then put scripture on the end and try to make it seem like it's the same, and then it's a copycat. But I think, you know, the example that you gave really helps people to think through it just a little bit more critically. When you're just, if you were to write a blog on the proof of the resurrection, what points would you list out as proof that Jesus did rise from the dead?
Well, there's so many different ways, Lisa, that we could go about it. And it depends on the crowd that I'm talking to. But since we're looking at something in just a nutshell here, I would point out, first of all, that when we are looking at things historically, just to look at what our expectations is, no historian can get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify certain conclusions. So you use historical method, and we talk in degrees of probability. So the first thing I would do is saying, you know, when there are skeptics and there are Christians, and everyone, no matter who you are, everyone is biased. So one of the things that we can do is let's just look at a couple of things that even skeptical historians, atheists, agnostics, Jewish historians, they regard them as fact. That would be things such as Jesus died by crucifixion, that shortly thereafter, his disciples had experiences of what they perceived was the risen Jesus appearing to them. And that 3, these experiences occurred not only to individuals, but also in group settings. And 4, you have a persecutor of the church named Paul, who also had an experience he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him. And it radically transformed his life from a persecutor of the church to one of its most aggressive advocates. Now, virtually 100% of scholars agree on those things. I wouldn't say 100% agree on the group appearances, but probably 75 to 85% would agree that these experiences occurred to groups as well, which rule out group hallucinations, of course. So the question then for the historian is, what's the best explanation for these? And then it's just easy to show how the resurrection hypothesis explains all 4 of these facts far better than any other explanation.
There was another question I got from someone yesterday, the Friday to Sunday, getting 3 days from Friday to Sunday. I'm sure you've heard that before. What is your response to that? Because it's like 3 days. So Friday night, they're like, well, did he die Friday morning? You know,
because the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights, or, you know, yeah, that's easy. What we're looking at here, Lisa, is a figure of speech. It's a temporal figure of speech that's similar to like what we would say today. I'll be with you in a minute. That'll take forever. Well, we don't really mean it will take forever. We don't even really mean we'll be there in 60 seconds. What we mean when we say we'll be there in a minute is we'll be there in a short period of time. It'll take forever. Oh, well, that could be half an hour. That could be an hour. It takes longer than I'm willing to give, you know? So how do we know this? Well, because we have in antiquity, we have like in the Akkadian medical literature, they would use the term, you'll be healed in 3 days, meaning a short period of time. You also have in the book of Esther, where the people come to her and they say, please help us with this. They're going to hang, what was his name? Her uncle, I think it was. Please, and then come after the rest of us Jews, please help. And she says, I'll tell you what, go and fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And after that, I will go into the king and speak to him. And it says that they did as she said. And then it says, on the 3rd day, she went in. Well, wait a minute. She said 3 days and 3 nights. And then she went in on the 3rd day. Well, what's that? See, we're looking at things with precision. As we talk about here, in the 21st century, they were indifferent in many cases to those kinds of things. So if you look at the 4 Gospels, if you look at Paul, throw him in there, he rose on the 3rd day, he rose after 3 days, he rose after 3 days and 3 nights. Well, it's just the 3-day motif is a figure of speech. And we can also show this through Matthew, in which it appears. So Jesus gives the sign of Jonah in Matthew when he says, when they say, show us a sign, and he says the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. Okay, well, then you come to his burial. And they bury him, and then the Jewish leaders come and they say to Pilate, this deceiver, while he was alive, said that he would be raised, after 3 days. So give us a guard until the 3rd day, so that his disciples won't be able to come and steal his body, and then the lie that comes after that will be greater than what we've currently heard. So here's the thing. He says he's going to be raised from the dead after 3 days, but they're only asking for a guard for the tomb until the 3rd day. So in other words, they're going to pull the guard away from the tomb at the time they need it most. Well, they wouldn't do that. So that just shows that the 3-day thing, it's just a motif. That's all it is. It means he'll be raised on a short period of time. That's all that means. It just so happens that he was crucified on Friday, and then there's Saturday, and then there was Sunday. He was raised on the 3rd day, but they're not looking in terms of 24-hour days and in precise terms. Mm-hmm. So it's wrong-headed to try to back the crucifixion up to Wednesday or Thursday in order to try to make it fit with the 3 days and 3 nights. Because if you do that, you still have a contradiction with on the 3rd day, mm-hmm. and things like that. So, yeah.
Do you ever get the pushback that, if the 3 days was figurative, why should we take the resurrection literal?
Oh, great question. And that one's easy too. Well, you look at the writings of the early Christians. Like, for example, perhaps, one of the earliest pieces of literature in the New Testament is Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians. And in chapter 15, you have some people in Corinth who are confusing the Christians, and they're saying, look, don't expect a resurrection someday. When you die, that's it. That's you don't exist anymore. And so Paul writes back to them, and he's saying, look, the general resurrection that we talk about when we will all be raised when Jesus returns, Jesus was the beginning of the first fruits of the general resurrection. And so since the two are inextricably linked, since it's the general resurrection. So if we're not going to be raised, then Christ was not raised. Okay. So, and he says, look, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. They have not been forgiven because he was a false prophet, a failed Messiah. Those who have died believing in Christ of your friends and relatives are forever lost. You are suffering persecution needlessly. I and the rest of the apostles, Paul says, would be telling a lie. And why would we be telling a lie about Jesus' resurrection? We make God a liar because we say that God raised Jesus when he didn't. Why would we lie if we're facing death and persecution every day? And you're facing it. If Jesus was not raised, we're not going to be raised. So let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Let's party today. Let's get all the ice cream, sex, drugs, whatever we want. Let's do it, because this life is all there is. So Paul, who's preaching the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles, is crystal clear in saying the resurrection of Jesus was a real event, because if it isn't, our faith is worthless. And then it's interesting to see, of course, all the Gospels talk about the resurrection in a historical sense. And then you've got the critics, the early critics of Christianity. Their rebuttals to the Christian claim are very telling. Matthew reports that the Jewish leadership were saying the disciples stole the body. In the middle of the 2nd century, you've got Justin Martyr saying that the Jewish leadership were saying the same thing. You've got Tertullian around the year 200 saying that skeptics were claiming that the gardener at the tomb reburied Jesus' body. You've got Celsus saying that Jesus faked his death. Now, notice that all of these objections are to explain our answers to the claim that Jesus rose from the dead and that we have an empty tomb. So all the skeptics understood the Christians to be speaking of the resurrection as a historical event, and not as a figure of speech. And then it's interesting to see how the Christians responded. They never came back and said, oh, well, wait a minute. We don't mean to say that Jesus was raised in a real sense. That's yuck. We're just saying that we still experience his presence today, or that he was exalted in heaven, or that his memory and teaching still live on with us today. No, they responded by saying, no, you're wrong on that. Jesus really did rise from the dead. The disciples did not steal the body of Jesus, and things like that. So there's no reason at all to think that the early Christians spoke of Jesus' resurrection as a figure of speech. Paul used it in metaphorical senses at times, but he also used it in a historical sense. He used both. But there's no reason to think that the earliest Christians were thinking they just used resurrection as a figure of speech.
Mm-hmm. Do you have time for one more question? I know our time is well spent here.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. What was the significance of the women being the first ones to report the resurrection of Jesus, and how does that give credence to the fact of the resurrection?
Good question. So, antiquity, things aren't like it is in Western countries today, where women have a fair shake at the table. It's not like in the United States, like it was 100 or 200 years ago. Women have a lot of rights now. So it's more like it probably was in Muslim countries today, where women are kept down. They're not, they don't have the same prestige or role status amongst humanity as men do. So in fact, Josephus wrote that a woman should never be allowed to testify because of her gender, the levity of her gender. And Josephus is a Jewish historian in the 1st century. You've got in the Talmud, another Jewish writing of antiquity, it says, better the law of God be burned than placed in the hands of a woman. Or blessed is the man whose children are male. Woe to him whose children are female. And you look into Greco-Roman literature, and you find that women just had a place in society that was subpar to what men had. So, given that, if you are going to invent a story, let's say Jesus did not rise from the dead, but you want to invent the story that he did, and you want to persuade people that he did, why on earth would you make the women your primary witnesses to the risen Jesus, to the empty tomb? They're the one that see the angel. They're the one that Jesus appears to first in Matthew's gospel. And where are the men? They're hiding. So it makes the men look bad. It makes the women look good. If you're going to invent a story and you want to persuade people, you're not going to make your primary witnesses of that story women. So this is what's called the criterion of embarrassment. It's that you just would, it would be an embarrassing. It'd be like things like when John says that none of Jesus' brothers believed in him, or when Mark and others report that Peter rebuked Jesus for telling them he would die and rise from the dead. And then Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." He calls him Satan. Well, why would you invent such a thing about the leader of the church who you want people to follow? You make him look bad. You make Jesus' brothers look bad, and Jesus too, because if Jesus couldn't even convince his brothers, then why should I believe him? So that's why it's important. The women become the primary witnesses in a society that look down on the testimony of a woman. And then we notice in 1 Corinthians 15 in verses 3-7, this oral tradition that has all these list appearances to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all the apostles. Women aren't listed. Why? Because this is the kerygma. This is the official, formal, public proclamation. And they don't mention the women because it's not going to get them any ground. It's just going to cause controversy. It'd be just like someone trying to say the Gospels are reliable. Let me tell you about all the apparent contradictions in them. You wouldn't bring that up in something like that. Now, we can address those things if asked. I've written a book on gospel differences, but you don't raise those things, and they're not going to bring the women up in public proclamation because of the problems that could. But the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have women discovering the empty tomb is profound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it just is one way that that Jesus kind of flips culture on his head throughout his interaction with women throughout the Gospels. So that's definitely helpful for those who are looking for resources on how they can be more equipped to engage this topic with skeptics on the resurrection. What books would you recommend?
Well, I don't want to sound self-promoting here, but years ago, back in 2004, Gary Habermas and I published a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And it is, in fact, it's our best-selling book. And it's a self-study course on this for non-scholars. And yet you'll be able to answer about 90% of the people you speak with. And it's actually got a CD in the back of it that works with PCs, not Macs, but PCs. And it's a simulated television game show with a 3-dimensional animated game show host who's pretty funny. And he helps you master the information that you learn in the book. And that video game cost over $250,000 to produce. We had a company that made tank simulators for the Department of Defense say that they wanted to do it for us at no cost. So they did. It was not owned by the government, but it was a, independent contractor, and they did it for us, Christian owned, and they did it for us for free. So, I mean, it's a fun game. So a lot of people found that book helpful. For those who really want to get in depth and really know the stuff, then my book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, it's over 700 pages. And that is more for the academically minded. They can get in and see where all the scholars are pointing and see what the original texts are saying, both in the Greek and the English translation, see the major objections and how to do historical method and all that kind of stuff. So that would be a suitable book. In fact, Habermas says that he thinks it's the best book written on the resurrection so far. If you're really wanting to get into the nitty gritty into it, most people don't need that. Most people don't want that. So the first book I mentioned will be sufficient for most.
Awesome.
And
how
then they can watch debates on this. I've got several debates they can watch on my YouTube channel.
Mhm. What's your YouTube channel and your social media handles? And and your last words for our audience.
YouTube channel, just go and type in my name, Mike Licona, Licona in YouTube, and they'll see my channel pop up. My on social media, go to my public figure page. I don't friend people on my personal page unless I know them. But on my public figure page, and that's where I do most of my posting anyway, the kind of stuff that they want, it's on my public figure page. That's facebook.com/michael.r.licona. Twitter is at Michael Licona. And final thing to say is, the resurrection of Jesus has a lot of good historical evidence that supports it. And if here's one thing, a big piece of advice I'd give. There are a lot of questions that come up. Gospel differences. I have some guy who's been emailing me now. He's really troubled because most scholars question whether the woman caught in adultery story was in the original Gospel of John, and it's bothering him. It's like we can get sidetracked with all these things, all these different. But here's the bottom line: if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true. Period. And it remains true even if it were to be the case that some things in the Bible were not. As long as a person keeps that in mind, these other things won't be so troublesome. Jesus rose from the dead, therefore Christianity is true. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it.
Awesome. Yes. And I believe that the resurrection is not fiction, but fact, to answer the question we posed at the beginning. So thank you, Dr. Licona. I really, really appreciate it. And I know our listeners will enjoy what you had to say.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
And one of the things I believe God has pressed upon me to press upon you is to raise a generation of Christians that are courageous and are not afraid to speak the truth in love.
Imagine what would have happened if he didn't listen to her because she was a spoil of war, because she was too young, because she was a woman. Wow. He would have missed out on his healing.
I didn't ask God why. When I became the first black woman to receive a PhD in Old Testament. I didn't ask God why when I became the first black woman to become the Lyman Beecher Lecturer at Yale. I didn't ask God why when Spelman made me the Cosby Visiting Professor. I didn't ask God why when I became the first black woman to receive tenure at Vanderbilt University. I'm surely ain't gonna ask God why now that I've got cancer.
I have a hope that is hard fought, hard won, and it's real.
To unflinchingly denounce the politics of fear and the alt-right racism that elected playboys while denouncing a black man who was loyal to his wife all his years in office.